everyone. I'm Dr. Piper Kendricks-Williams, and I'm the chair of African American Studies. I'm also jointly appointed in the English department. The African American Studies Department at TCNJ is devoted to promoting scholarship and dialogue on issues related to Africa and its diaspora. The students in our major interrogate the multi-dimensions of race, slavery, and colonialism, and their continued political, social, and cultural significance. In this department, we also teach a number of skills that employers in the 21st century are very interested in, including the importance of cultural and intercultural communication, global awareness, ethical awareness, the ability to analyze and solve complex problems, and the ability to apply knowledge in real-world settings. We also make a wonderful dual major. Because most of our curriculum also counts for liberal learning, students can take 2/3 of their major courses, and they will also count for liberal learning. Currently, we have students doing a dual major from the School of Science as well as the School of Education. We have students double majoring across the School of Humanities and Social Science as well. Despite our department's extremely small size, we have a great impact on the campus and the national community. We have helped develop and support the curriculum. Our department is one of the only departments on campus that's truly anti-racist. To my mind, that includes two essential aspects. To be anti-racist, which is a verb, something that's continually try to be, it's not a noun. You have to dismantle, well, you have to acknowledge and then dismantle white supremacy. And you also have to center the experience of people of African descent. Our curriculum is focused on the presence and contribution of people from the African diaspora. We cover 400 years of people in the New World, both in the United States and the Caribbean. In addition, we have courses on Africa that go back thousands of years. We also have an activist tradition and have classes that count for the social justice minor. Our classes are also very often cross-listed because we look at the intersections between race, class, gender, and sexuality. Personally, in my own classes, I teach African-American literature. I usually start in the 1770s in my first African-American literature to 1920 with Phyllis Wheatley. And then we move through the slave narratives and the period of Reconstruction. In my spring class, I really focus in on the artistic traditions that relate to Black political progress and civil rights. So we look at the Harlem Renaissance and actually the Black arts movement, Black women's writing, and also the writing in the 80s that really deal with the multiple violences that Black people have faced through the centuries. I also teach a capstone on what's called Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism is an idea that is interesting to me in my own research right now. It was coined in 1993 by a scholar named Mark Deary. He wondered how Black people whose histories have been erased and so impossible to trace can imagine possible futures. He thinks that the answer is yes, and he finds it in all forms of Black writing and genre. For me personally, I'm really interested in the ways that Black people have always had to be Afrofuturistic. When I teach Harriet Jacobs' narrative in the fall, I think about the ways that when she's hiding herself in the attic away from her slave master, that she is actually having sort of a supernatural alternative reality experience. She's also kind of time traveling because she's sort of stuck in time while her master searched for her in the North. I think it's quite impossible for any Black person to have survived the myriad of oppressions without being able to imagine the future. Thank you. I look forward to meeting you in a class one day.
Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. Hi, I am Dr. Leanne Francis, and I'm a historian of mass incarceration with a focus on Black women prisoners in the early 1900s New York City. In my scholarship and teaching, my goal is to shed light on the past in order to better understand the present. At TCNJ, I love that I get to teach courses such as racism, crime, and prisons in US history, the history of Black women prisoners, the history of Black Lives Matter, the history of queer and trans people of color in the United States. I love that I'm doing this work as a professor in the African American Studies department, because in the classroom, students and teachers of African American Studies are doing the critical work of intersectional anti-racism, the kind of anti-racist work, the kind of social justice work that prepares us and empowers us to transform our communities into domains that will be equitable and safer for Black people. Thank you.
Welcome, future TCNJ students. I am Professor Mitchell, and I teach in the Departments of African American Studies and Criminology. I am a critical criminologist who critiques power, privilege, and racism in their relation to systems of oppression, namely the criminal legal system. Here at TCNJ, I've taught an assortment of social justice-oriented courses that examine how social identifiers such as race, ethnicity, class, and gender, among others, intersect and impact people and communities of color in their contact with, navigation through, and transition out of the criminal legal system. For example, in my previously taught School to Prison Pipeline course, students and I closely examine the ways in which marginalized and vulnerable, primarily K through 12 students are first labeled, then through a variety of mechanisms funneled into the juvenile and adult court systems. In my race, crime, and justice course, students and I examine the differential treatment and experiences of various racial and ethnic groups by the police, courts, and correctional system in the United States. In all of my courses, I challenge students to think and engage critically, while encouraging respectful debate about controversial local and national issues. At TCNJ, we also have a newly instituted minor in social justice studies, where I teach one of the foundational courses, Introduction to Social Justice. In this course, students and I collectively discuss and interrogate issues such as racism, sexism, ableism, and youth oppression, among others, while developing strategic plans to help create the type of world in which we want to live. As a researcher, I am deeply concerned about the impact of incarceration on families, especially within the Black community. In my work, I conduct qualitative interviews with formerly incarcerated parents transitioning from jail, state, and federal prisons to better understand how they navigate the challenges of community reentry, as well as reconnect with their children. Despite the heartbreaking stories I've heard and collected, most of my participants express great joy and pride in being a parent, despite the challenges of having a criminal record. As an interdisciplinary scholar, I believe that African American studies is important because it teaches the nation and world about the rich history and culture, and yet challenges of a people that until this day, the nation and world continuously tries to ignore and obliterate. Thank you, look forward to meeting you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mitchell. That was really inspiring. Hi, my name is Dr. Zakiyah Adair. I'm a professor in women's and gender sexuality studies, as well as African American studies. I got my PhD in women's studies, and I also got my undergrad degree in African American studies and philosophy. So my teaching and my research are actually very similar to one another and very much connected to who I am and also what my broader interests are. I'm a feminist scholar and my research is interdisciplinary. So I utilize both historical and also literary analysis methods as a way of thinking about and documenting and interpreting Black cultural production. Specifically, I'm interested in the ways that Black women who were performers in the late 19th and early 20th century, in the way that they traveled abroad in a transatlantic context, and specifically France and England, and the way that they used the international as a way to extend and talk about the Black experience, and also to extend and talk about suffering that was going on in the United States with regard to Black Americans. So specifically, I look at Josephine Baker, who's the most famous of the cohorts. You might have heard of her. And I look at the ways that her Blackness was interpreted both in the US, but also in France. And something that is interesting about this focus is that when Black women like Josephine Baker go abroad in France, they insert themselves into a larger colonial narrative with regard to colonial constructions of Blackness. And so the thing that I'm very interested in is how does that impact broader constructions of Blackness? How does that impact how Black Africans experience race in France and in England? And how does that impact the way that Black Americans are experiencing Blackness in the United States? So in this way, there's this sort of going back and going forward. And the other thing that I'm really interested in with regard to culture and expressive performance is how do Black American women who were not very wealthy or well-educated, how do they rise out of fairly oppressive situations in the United States and become these sort of international global superstars? And what does that mean? And ultimately, what it tells us is that performance is complex and that oftentimes Black performers utilize things that are somewhat oppressive, but they also can at the same time be liberating. So you can have Black American women like Josephine Baker who extend and perhaps highlight racist colonial constructions of Blackness at the same time of advocating for equality in the United States. So it's really interesting what happens with that. My teaching is very much connected to this. I teach a course on the relationship between race and gender and cultural production, specifically looking at how Black intellectual leaders like Alice Dunbar Nelson, how they relate to Black cultural production and performance and expressive performance particularly. I also teach a course on Black feminist thought, and I'm super excited about that. And I teach another course on African Americans in film, specifically looking at the way that Black filmmakers use the medium as a way to advance and a way to push back against racist ideas of Blackness. I hope that you come to TCNJ, and I definitely hope you come to African American Studies. For me, this is not just a work, and it's not just a discipline of study. For me, this is a personal sort of history and trajectory. And I say that to say that when I was an undergraduate student, I was originally going to go to law school, and I was a philosophy and French major, and I took a course on African American Studies, and it was the first time that Blackness had been centered. It was the first time that I ever had a Black professor, and it was also the first time that I ever had a language to understand and articulate how I experienced race and racial oppression on systemic levels. And it blew me away in so many profound ways. Most importantly, it changed the direction of my life. And I will forever be connected both intellectually, but also personally with African American Studies. So I hope you come here.
Thank you, Dr. Adair. Welcome, everyone. Hello, I am Dr. Brown-Glaude, and I am Professor of African American Studies and also the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And my research focuses on race and ethnicity in the context of the US, but also diaspora. So my current research looks at how race is understood and experienced in the Caribbean, particularly in the island of Jamaica. As a sociologist, I'm trained, and one of the assumptions of the African American Studies Department is that race is a social construction. And what we mean by that is that it is not tied to biology. You're not born Black. How do we understand that? Well, what my research shows and what I teach is that understandings and experiences of Blackness differ from context to context. So the way in which Blackness is understood here in the United States may differ if you travel to Brazil or to Jamaica or to the Dominican Republic or even Haiti. In the Dominican Republic, for instance, if you're brown skin and have straight hair, you may not be considered Black. You may be considered Indio, which is a mixed race category. But if your hair looks like mine in the Dominican Republic, you would be considered Black. And so the question that we grapple with in our department is, how is that the case? How can we understand that? And it reinforces our understanding of race as socially constructed. So in my research, I unpack that, right, in the context of Jamaica, but I also teach that. So the classes that I teach in the department are race and ethnicity in Latin America and the Caribbean, race and ethnicity in the US. And I also teach a course on gender and globalization, because in addition to understanding race and how race is experienced in the diaspora, I'm also very interested in the experiences of women of color, especially those who are working in the global economy. So in my classes, I teach about sex workers of color, I teach about garment workers, I teach about domestic workers, and what are some of their experiences as women of color in the global economy. In our department, we embrace the idea of interdisciplinarity. And what we mean by that is you will be in a class, say a class with Dr. Adair or Dr. Francis or Dr. Williams and Dr. Mitchell, and where you're reading a wide array of scholarship, whether it's history, sociology, literature, film, because from our perspective, all of these different disciplines can provide us with a holistic understanding of the topic. And so we fully embrace that in our department. And we also embrace that in our scholarship. So I've just published a book, the Toni Morrison Book Club, with my colleague, Dr. Williams, where again, we work collaboratively across disciplines, across departments, in order to provide a holistic understanding of Toni Morrison's work. I fully encourage you to consider African American studies because from my experience, African American studies was the first department where I saw myself, right? As a woman of color, as a woman from the Caribbean, it provided me with the space to allow me to understand my experiences here in the US context, and of course, outside of the US. But it's also African-American studies, we work very hard to create a space that students will see as a home away from home, in our research, in our scholarship, but also in our mentoring. And so I hope that you will consider us. And if you have any questions that we can answer, we're fully, we'll make ourselves available to answer any questions that you will have. So I hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, future TCNJ students. We look forward to meeting you. Bye-bye.